At 3:17 a.m. on the morning of August 2nd, 2015, a 911 dispatcher in Davidson County, North Carolina, picked up a call. On the other end of the line was Thomas Martens, a man who had just admitted striking his son-in-law with a baseball bat. The call lasted just over 14 minutes. When paramedics reached the house on Panther Creek Court less than 10 minutes later, what they found inside the master bedroom was horrifying. Blood across the walls. Blood in the bathroom. A man on the bedroom floor whose injuries were severe enough that pieces of his skull came away when they tried to move him. This is the case of Molly Corbett and Thomas Martens, and the 8-year legal battle over whether what happened inside that bedroom was an act of self-defense or a carefully constructed murder. His name was Jason Corbett. He was 39 years old, born in Limerick, Ireland, in 1976. A father of two, a man people who knew him describe, without exception, as warm, uncomplicated, and entirely without ego. Jason Corbett grew up in a close, traditional Irish household, alongside his twin brother Wayne and his sister Tracy. By every account, it was a happy upbringing, full of warmth and ordinary. He went on to build a steady, respectable career at a packaging company in Limerick, the kind of job that doesn't make headlines but anchors a life. He met Margaret Fitzpatrick, known to everyone as Mags, through a mutual friend on a night out in Limerick. Their friend Lynn said she knew almost immediately the two of them were meant for each other. Jason wasn't, by his sister's account, someone people thought of as a romantic. Then Mags came along, and that changed. They married on June 28, 2003. Their son, Jack, arrived the following year, on September 18, 2004. 2 years after that, on September 2, 2006, their daughter Sarah was born. By every account, those years were quietly, unremarkably happy, the kind of happiness you only really notice once it's gone. It was gone 2 months later. Mags had lived with asthma her whole life. One night in November 2006, with her sister Catherine staying over, she reached suddenly for her inhaler. Jason got her to the car and drove as fast as he could toward University Hospital Limerick. She didn't survive the trip. Jason was 30 years old. He now had a 2-year-old son and a 2-month-old daughter, and the woman everyone around him understood to be the center of his world was simply gone. What he did next tells you almost everything about who Jason Corbett was. He didn't withdraw from his children to grieve privately. He didn't hand them off to relatives while he tried to rebuild something for himself. He visited Mags's grave, by multiple accounts, more than once a day, bringing flowers, reading her the news, telling her how Jack and Sarah were getting on. He ran the household. He went to work. He raised 2 small children essentially alone, while carrying a grief most people never have to face that young. In April 2008, looking for help with childcare, Jason placed an advertisement for a live-in au pair. A 24-year-old American woman from Knoxville, Tennessee, answered it. Her name was Molly Martens. She moved into the Corbett household in Limerick to help raise Jack and Sarah. By 2010, the relationship between Jason and Molly had moved from professional to personal. They became engaged that February. They married the following year, in Knoxville, and Jason made a decision that says as much about his devotion to his children as anything else in his life. He uprooted the family entirely, transferring with his company to its North Carolina offices near Winston-Salem, selling his home in Limerick, and combining those proceeds with his life savings to buy a house at Panther Creek Court in Walbug, a golf community home that cost $390,000. He had given up everything familiar in Ireland to build something stable for Jack and Sarah in America. From the outside, it looked like exactly that, a stable, comfortable family. Jason worked. Molly raised the children. They lived in an attractive home in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. But according to his sister Tracy, the marriage had begun fracturing well before 2015. Jason had told her he was unhappy. He'd told her Molly had been behaving strangely. And, this detail matters enormously for what comes later, he told her he wanted to bring the children home to Ireland. Not as a passing complaint, but as an actual, forming plan. Investigators would later confirm that Jason had, in fact, been exploring exactly that, a return to Limerick with both children, in the weeks immediately surrounding his death. Saturday, August 1st, 2015, began as an ordinary family weekend. Molly's parents, Thomas and Sharon Martens, arrived at the Walbug house that evening for a visit, settling into the basement guest room before the household turned in for the night. Jason had had some drinks over the course of the day. By every account, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing anyone flagged as concerning. Nothing about that evening, on the surface, looked like the last night of anyone's life. To understand Molly Corbett and her father, you have to understand who Thomas Martens was before any of this happened. He wasn't an ordinary father-in-law. He held a law degree from Emory University, and he had spent 30 years as a Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent, a career built entirely around understanding exactly what investigators look for and exactly what a credible self-defense account needs to contain. That matters, because of what a former colleague would later tell the court. Joanne Lowry, who had worked alongside Martens at the U.S. Department of Energy, testified that before Molly and Jason's 2011 wedding, Martens had expressed open dislike for his future son-in-law, describing Jason's Irish wedding guests as rude and rowdy. In a separate conversation, roughly 2 months before Jason's death, Lowry said Martens told her plainly, "That son-in-law, I hate him." 2 months. That's the gap between that sentence and the night a baseball bat. One investigators say Martens had brought to the house, ostensibly as a gift for young Jack, ended up covered in blood and human hair. That's who was in the house on Panther Creek Court that weekend. A father-in-law who, by a witness's sworn account, harbored real hostility toward his son-in-law, a daughter whose marriage was already unraveling, and a husband who had quietly started making plans to take his children somewhere none of them could follow. We're going to hold off, for just a moment, on walking through exactly what investigators found inside that bedroom. The spatter patterns, the toxicology, the number 12. Because in the immediate aftermath, what the world knew was only this: a 911 call, a dead man, and a father and daughter telling officers they had acted to save Molly's life. At first, that account stood largely unchallenged, but it would not stay that way. Within few hours, investigators were already confronting a problem. The story coming from inside that house didn't match the physical evidence they saw in the bedroom. Paramedics David Bent and Amanda Hackworth arrived in under 10 minutes. What they documented immediately raised questions. Jason's skin, Hackworth would later testify, was abnormally cool to the touch, cooler than it should have been if help had genuinely been summoned the moment the altercation ended. The 911 dispatcher noted something else. A caller who claimed to have just performed sustained chest compressions, sounding entirely calm, not winded at all. Neither Molly Corbett nor Thomas Martens showed injuries consistent with the prolonged, violent struggle they described. Molly pointed to a small mark on her neck and said her throat hurt, but when a crime scene examiner photographed her from every angle specifically looking for evidence of strangulation, he found nothing matching her account, and even had to ask her to stop rubbing at her own neck while he took the pictures. Crime scene examiner Lieutenant Frank Young and Detective B. Smith surveyed the room and documented something investigators would return to again and again over the following years. The physical evidence in that bedroom did not, in their assessment, support the account of a prolonged, desperate fight for survival. Within hours of being released from police questioning, Molly Corbett paid roughly $5,500 to have the house professionally, industrially cleaned of blood. Jason's family, meanwhile, was already on a plane from Ireland. When they landed, they were told Molly intended to have Jason cremated before they could see him. Authorities intervened to block it. Jason's family was only granted access to his remains after agreeing, in writing, to cover the full cost of his funeral and the cost of returning his body to Ireland. In the days immediately following Jason's death, there was a version of events that, on its own, could have closed this case quickly and quietly. A man assaulting his wife, a protective father stepping in, a tragic but legally defensible outcome. Thomas Martens gave that account to investigators in detail, repeatedly, with a composure experienced detectives specifically noted in their reports. He emphasized, again and again, the same legal touchstones: his state of mind, his belief Jason intended to kill Molly, the immediacy of the threat. For a brief window, that account held. It was detailed. It was internally consistent. It came from a man whose 30-year FBI career made him, on paper, a credible narrator of his own crisis. It began to fall apart as the forensic evidence came back. Dr. Craig Nelson, associate pathologist for the North Carolina Chief Medical Examiner's Office, testified that Jason had been struck in the head at least 12 times, across at least 10 distinct locations, and that the damage to his skull was so extensive that, in places, individual blows could no longer even be distinguished from one another. 2 weapons were used: the aluminum baseball bat Thomas Martens admitted swinging, and a concrete paving brick Molly admitted striking her husband with. At 2 points on the back of Jason's head, the wounds from both weapons actually overlapped, damage so layered that investigators couldn't determine which weapon had struck first or which blow had been the one that killed him. Forensic analysis presented at trial indicated that the pattern on the hem of Thomas Martens's boxer shorts was consistent with someone standing over Jason as the bat came down, not beside him, not defending against an attacker on top of him, but above him. There is a detail that never got the attention it deserves. The medical examiner found trazodone in Jason Corbett's system, a sedative he had no prescription for and, by every account, had never taken. Trial records showed that Molly Corbett had obtained a prescription for trazodone just 3 days before her husband died. No one has ever offered an explanation, on the record, for why a drug she had just been prescribed ended up in her husband's body 3 days later. Neither defendant had visible injuries consistent with the violent, sustained fight they described. Crime scene investigators documented a scene that, in their professional assessment, did not match the account being given to them in real time. Prosecutors laid out 2 converging incentives. First, custody. Jason's 2007 will named his sister Tracy and her husband as guardians for Jack and Sarah in the event of his death, meaning that if Jason left Molly, as he was reportedly planning to do, she stood to lose the children entirely. But if something happened to Jason instead, custody became, at minimum, contestable. Second, money, a $600,000 life insurance policy on Jason's life. An attempt to cremate Jason before his own family could see his body. A father-in-law with a documented, witnessed statement of hatred for his son-in-law, made 2 months before the killing. All this evidence, none of them, on its own, proves murder, but together, prosecutors argued, they described something far more deliberate than a man defending his daughter in a moment of panic. Here is the part of this case that should unsettle you more than the violence itself. Thomas Martens had spent 3 decades as an FBI agent, interviewing suspects, evaluating statements, and helping build criminal cases. He understood how investigators examine a scene, how prosecutors assess evidence, and how claims of self-defense are scrutinized. Yet in his very first interaction with police, not days later, not after consulting an attorney, but almost immediately, his explanation centered on fear, imminent danger, and the need to protect his daughter. Whether that account reflected exactly what happened inside the bedroom, or whether it was a narrative shaped by years of law enforcement experience, became one of the central questions of the case. But that doesn't prove guilt by itself. People in genuine crisis can sometimes describe their experience with remarkable clarity. But set beside the trazodone in Jason's blood, the lack of significant injuries consistent with a violent struggle, the bloodstain evidence that prosecutors argued was inconsistent with the account given by Molly and Thomas, and a witness who testified that Thomas had expressed hatred toward Jason just 2 months earlier, the pieces begin to form a pattern that prosecutors argued pointed towards something far more deliberate than a desperate act of self-defense. And then there's the most painful irony in this entire case, one that didn't surface until years later. Jack and Sarah Corbett, 11 and 8 years old when their father died, gave statements to police in the immediate aftermath describing instances of their father's anger and alleged volatility. Those statements were excluded from the original 2017 trial as unreliable hearsay, a decision the defense argued, and ultimately won on appeal, had denied Molly and Thomas Martens a fair shot at proving self-defense. Years later, as adults, Jack and Sarah told the court something devastating, that those childhood statements had been shaped. They used the word manipulated by the woman who was, at the time, their legal guardian. The very testimony a young, traumatized child gave under his stepmother's influence became, years later, the legal mechanism that helped overturn her murder conviction. The court was right, procedurally, that those statements should have been heard. It does not make the outcome any less devastating for the two people whose childhood words were used against the memory of their own father. In January 2016, 5 months after Jason's death, Davidson County investigators filed second-degree murder charges against both Molly Corbett and Thomas Martens. For a 30-year FBI veteran, the arrest meant something almost unthinkable. Sitting, for the first time in his career, on the wrong side of a criminal defense table. Both were taken into custody. Both denied the charges. Both would maintain, from that point forward, that what happened inside that bedroom was an act of desperate self-defense, not a killing born of resentment, motive, or planning. Jury selection began on July 17, 2017, in Davidson County Superior Court, Judge David Lee presiding. Both defendants pleaded not guilty. District Attorney Alan Martin laid out the prosecution's case piece by piece. More than a dozen blows to Jason's head, trazodone in his bloodstream despite having no prescription for the drug, a body that paramedics believed had been dead longer than the defendants claimed, and a motive prosecutors argued was rooted in custody of the children and a $600,000 life insurance policy. The defense countered with 5 witnesses testifying to a pattern of what they described as Jason's unpredictable behavior toward Molly, including a secretly recorded argument, captured 5 months before his death, in which the children could be heard in the background asking their parents to stop fighting. A domestic violence expert testified about the fear Molly and her father said they felt that night. The defense also highlighted real gaps in the state's forensic work. The blood on Martens's boxer shorts was never definitively tested to confirm whose it was, and not every blood sample in the house had been analyzed. It was Judge Lee's decision to exclude Jack and Sarah's police statements that would prove most consequential, not in 2017, but years later. On August 9, 2017, the jury returned its verdict, guilty, on both defendants, of second-degree murder. Jury foreman Tom Amon told reporters the panel had been unanimous on Thomas Martens almost immediately. On Molly, the initial split was 10-2 before a careful review of the crime scene photographs brought the jury to a unanimous decision. There are no winners in this case, Amon said. Everybody loses. Judge Lee sentenced each of them to between 20 and 25 years. As she was led from the courtroom, Molly turned to her mother and said, "I'm so sorry. I should have just let him kill me." This was not the end. 5 years after a jury found Molly Corbett and Thomas Martens guilty of second-degree murder, the case took an extraordinary turn. In 2020, the North Carolina Court of Appeals overturned both convictions, ruling that the trial judge had wrongly excluded statements made by Jack and Sarah during their childhood, evidence the defense argued was critical to its claim of self-defense. The following year, in a narrow 4-3 decision, the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld that ruling. After years behind bars, Molly and Thomas walked out of prison on $200,000 bond. A new trial was ordered. This time, it would not be held in Davidson County. The case had drawn years of intense media attention, and a judge ruled the retrial should be moved to neighboring Forsyth County in search of a more impartial jury. It never happened. On October 30, 2023, Molly Corbett pleaded no contest, and Thomas Martens pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. The second-degree murder charges were formally dropped. On November 9, 2023, Judge David Hall sentenced each of them to between 4 years, 3 months and 6 years, 2 months, and with credit for the 3 years and 8 months they had already served following the original conviction. Both had as little as 7 months left to serve. By June 2024, both were free. By June 2025, both had completed parole. A man beaten to death with a bat and a brick, struck at least 12 times. There is a cruel irony at the heart of this case that's almost too painful to say plainly. The same legal protections built to safeguard children's voices. The principle that a child's statement deserves scrutiny and context before it's used against anyone became, in this case, the exact mechanism that helped the people who killed their father avoid the consequences. Jack and Sarah didn't ask for their childhood words to be weaponized in either direction. They were 8 and 11. And by the time they were old enough to stand up in a courtroom and say, in their own voices, what they actually believed had happened to them, the legal system had already moved on without them. After the 2023 plea and sentencing, Jason's family released a statement making clear that a finished sentence was not the same thing as a finished reckoning. That Molly Corbett and Thomas Martens may have completed their legal punishment, but they would carry, for the rest of their lives, the knowledge of what they had done. At sentencing, Sarah Corbett, by then a teenager who had spent years in therapy, told the court that her childhood words had been twisted and used to help the people who killed her father escape full accountability. Jack told the court plainly that he did not want the judge fooled by Molly Corbett, calling her manipulative and saying she had weaponized things he said as an 8-year-old. Within weeks of Jason's death, his sister, Tracy Lynch, successfully won custody of Jack and Sarah, bringing them back to Limerick, Ireland, where she has raised them ever since. She also pursued a federal wrongful death lawsuit against Molly Corbett, Thomas Martens, and Sharon Martens, a case that was ultimately settled out of court. She had been, by every account that survives this case, exactly what Jason would have wanted for his children, a steady, fiercely protective presence, doing for them what their father no longer could. Jack and Sarah Corbett grew up in Limerick, the city where their father was born, raised by the aunt who refused to let his memory be rewritten by the people responsible for his death. They are adults now, old enough to speak for themselves in a courtroom, which is precisely what the legal system failed to let them do when it mattered most, when they were children whose words were taken from them before they understood what those words would later be used for. On August 26, 2015, following a funeral mass at Our Lady Queen of Peace Church in Limerick, Jason Corbett was laid to rest at Castlemongret Cemetery, beside his first wife, Mags, the wife whose grave he visited every day for the better part of a decade, refusing to let her memory fade. Now he rests beside her. Jason Corbett gave up everything familiar to him, his country, his home, his savings, to build something safe for 2 children who had already lost their mother once. He spent a decade trying to make sure they never felt that loss again. In the end, the children he had spent years trying to shield from tragedy were left to grieve a second parent. There's no clean justice in this story. There's only what's left: 2 grown children who finally got to tell the truth in their own words, and a grave in Limerick where a man who never stopped showing up for the people he loathed is, at last, no longer alone. If you found this documentary meaningful, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue telling stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.